Well, good evening, everybody. This is Empowering Democracy. It's Thursday night. On Thursday night, we usually do a neoliberalism show. And even though I don't have it in the title this week, this indeed is going to be a neoliberalism show. The topic that we're going to be talking about tonight is, can credit rating agencies discipline monetary sovereigns? The international credit rating agencies that give nations credit ratings. We're talking about places like Moody's, Standard and Poor, and Fitch. So we have a lot to say about that tonight. I should add, I will be joined in a few minutes by Dee Pierce, the host of Around the World with Dee and Friends. And she should be joining me any minute now, I think. But I want to start off the show tonight with a news announcement from the Fiscal Times. The Fiscal Times is a publication that has been funded and founded by the Peter G. Peterson Foundation. So it is, we can say with justification, that it is a neoliberal rag. And you should be seeing the Fiscal Times piece now. A U.S. credit rating downgraded from AAA by Fitch, one of the credit ratings agencies. This article is by Yuval Rosenberg, who is the editor of the Fiscal Times and writes a lot of the articles too. It's from August 1st, 2023. Fitch Ratings downgraded the long-term credit rating of the United States from AAA to AA plus on Tuesday, citing the U.S. government's debt burden and its expected fiscal deterioration over the next 3 years. Fitch, one of three major agencies that evaluate the creditworthiness of companies and countries, also pointed to what it called, and quote, erosion of governance, unquote, over the past 2 decades. A change, it says, quote, that has been manifested in repeated debt limit standoffs and last-minute resolutions. So the agency in May had placed the U.S. rating on, quote, negative watch, unquote, indicating that a downgrade might be coming after a bruising political battle over raising the debt limit. You remember that struggle. We covered it here. House Speaker Kevin McCarthy and a newly empowered Republican House majority had insisted on spending cuts and other demands in exchange for raising the federal borrowing limit. And after saying he wasn't going to bargain about that, Joe Biden, of course, bargained about it. Out came a bipartisan deal to suspend the debt limit until 2025. That was signed into law in early June, just days before the Treasury was poised to potentially default on its obligations. I have to point out here that it wouldn't have been necessary for the Treasury to default on its obligations, because the debt limit didn't have to be raised at all in order for the Treasury to get the funds it needed to spend the appropriations of Congress and to meet its obligations. And that reflects also on the first paragraph of this article. Fitch Ratings downgraded the long-term credit rating of the United States from AAA to AA plus on Tuesday, citing the U.S.'s debt burden and its, quote, expected fiscal deterioration over the next 3 years. As I've said on numerous occasions over the preceding months and preceding years, the debt burden of the U.S., in the sense of the level of the outstanding debt, or in the sense of the debt to GDP ratio, neither of these has any impact on the fiscal sustainability of a monetary sovereign government such as the United States. Okay. The reason why is very simple. According to the Constitution of the United States, Article 1, Section 8, our government can always create the money it needs to fulfill any obligation, to repay any debt burden, to annihilate any debt to GDP ratio and bring it down to zero. In other words, the whole premise of Fitch Ratings is false. It's based on the idea that there are debts which the U.S. government cannot pay. There are debt burdens that are too heavy, that there can be a fiscal deterioration over the next 3 years, in the sense that an increasing debt burden is a fiscal deterioration. That is false. The only thing that can be a fiscal deterioration, in the United States is the legitimacy of the U.S. currency itself. If that were to deteriorate, if people ceased to believe in dollars, but decided they were only going to believe in gold, then that would speak to the fiscal sustainability, that is the ability of the U.S. government to continue to spend what it had to spend to meet, its obligations. As long as U.S. currency is accepted in repayment of debts, however, there is no fiscal sustainability problem here in the U.S. It doesn't matter how high the debt goes. It doesn't matter how high the debt to GDP ratio goes. So, Dee Pierce, the host of Around the World with Dee and Friends, has joined us. What happened to her? I heard her join us, so here she is. Hello, Dee.
Hello, how you doing?
I'm doing great. How are you doing?
I'm doing great. I'm happy to see Lana in the comment section.
Oh yeah, I hadn't seen Lana. I hadn't checked the comment section. Hey Lana. And Lana says, howdy, I know all about credit ratings. Grown. Yeah, grown indeed. Okay, so we're going over this article from the Fiscal Times where Fitch downgraded the credit rating of the United States from AAA to AA plus. And the reasons they gave were the debt burden of the United States and its expected fiscal deterioration over the next 3 years. I have just explained that since the United States, according to the Constitution, Article 1, Section 8, can create as much money as it wishes to create to meet any debt burden, no matter the level of that debt burden, no matter the level of the ratio of the debt, to GDP. There is no danger to creditors coming from the debt burden itself, from the debt level itself, or from the debt to GDP ratio, no matter how high. Okay. I was in the middle of pointing out here when you came in that the agency in May, that is the credit agency, had placed the U.S. rating on negative watch, indicating that a downgrade might be coming after a bruising political battle over raising the debt limit. So you remember that it was a knockdown, drag-out fight. The administration decided to settle it, not by creating new money, which it very easily could have done. Specifically, it could have minted as many trillion-dollar coins as it wanted to mint, or a single trillion-dollar coin of $100 trillion. It chose not to do that. It also chose not to use the 14th Amendment. Instead, it chose to compromise with the Republicans on the debt limit and to take on certain spending cuts, which were damaging to poor people who depended on the programs whose spending was cuts. So that was unfortunate on the part of the Biden government, but it came about because of the neoliberal beliefs of the Biden government that the federal government can only spend based on taxing, and borrowing. We all know from many previous streams that that notion is false. Going on with the article, quote, the repeated debt limit political standoffs and last-minute resolutions have eroded confidence in fiscal management, Fitch said. Well, that may be true, but the confidence of the private sector in the fiscal management of the federal government has nothing to do with the ability of the federal government to repay its debts. So why are they making decisions based on whether there's confidence in the fiscal management of the United States or not? That has nothing to do with the question. What the decisive point is Article 1, Section 8, the ability of the federal government to pay any debt, no matter how large. Quote, Fitch said, quote, in addition, the government lacks a medium-term fiscal framework, unlike most peers, and has a complex budgeting process. These factors, along with several economic shocks as well as tax cuts and new spending initiatives, have contributed to successive debt increases over the last decade. In addition, there has been only limited progress in tackling medium-term challenges related to rising Social Security and Medicare costs due to an aging population. Okay. The idea that these are medium term challenges of any significance, of course, is a neoliberal idea because people who believe, okay, that the federal government can only spend money based on the tax revenue it raises or the money it raises, okay, from borrowing money through the issuance of bonds. Those people simply do not believe that the federal government uh, can meet challenges related to rising Social Security and Medicare costs by simply creating money. What they believe is that there would have to be increased taxes or cuts to the program or further borrowing, which of course they don't favor because they're continually inveighing against the debt limit. So Fitch projects that, quote, the general government deficit will rise from 3.7% of GDP in 2022 to 6.3% in 2023, 6.6% in 2024, and 6.9% in 2025. Well, I got to say, I hope that the general government deficit rises to a level that's far higher than that. Because if that's the size of our deficit, if we have deficits covered by debt issuance that rise to only 6.3%, 6.6%, and 6.9%, that won't be deficits that will be large enough to avoid a recession. I'm telling you that right now. If we want to be prosperous and we want to avoid recession, we need to have deficits of at least 10% per year. We'll get into some of that in some of the other articles again, but let's go forward. But 10% of GDP. Okay. It also warned about the longer-term outlook over the next decade, higher interest rates, and rising debt stock will increase the interest service burden, while an aging population and rising healthcare costs will raise spending on the elderly absent fiscal policy reforms. Well, of course, that's a very empty statement because there have to be changes in fiscal policy in order to see other projections that are more favorable. In other words, Congress has to act. So what? Okay, that's a political problem. It's not an inevitability. It's a political issue we're talking about here. And about higher interest rates. Higher interest rates are not an inevitability. Interest rates are a policy variable. They are determined by the Federal Reserve and the Treasury Department in combination, as I will make clear as I move through the articles today. Fitch also says, that additionally, the 2017 tax cuts are set to expire in 2025. But there is likely to be political pressure to make these permanent, as had been the case in the past, resulting in higher deficit projections. This is probably true that there will be that kind of pressure. And it's probably true that unless we change the political system, we're going to see the higher projections. But once again, higher projections are not such a bad thing if they get us closer to the 10 to 12% of GDP deficit that we're going to need in order to prevent having recessions, in our economy. Biden administration strongly disagrees, Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen said in a statement, with the decision, which she called arbitrary and based on outdated data. She argued that the indicators Fitch uses in making its decision declined between 2018. So basically, what she said, Janet Yellen said, is they got the wrong data. She doesn't say what she should say, that since the United States can never voluntarily default, that Fitch has it all wrong. It is not based on how large the debt burden is. It is not based on how large the debt to GDP ratio is. Those things do not matter for reasons I've already stated. She added the administration has passed bipartisan legislation to address the debt limit and invest in infrastructure and U.S. competitiveness. Well, Fitch certainly knows that. It was complaining about how long it took to get to that legislation. The White House also said it strongly disagrees with the decision, but also blamed Republicans for undermining the economy. So, in other words, they played Who Struck John. Quote, the ratings model used by Fitch declined under President Trump, then improved under President Biden, and it defies reality to downgrade the United States at a moment when President Biden has delivered the strongest recovery of any major economy in the world, unquote. Again, that gets into the technicalities of the Fitch model and whether they were acting in a manner that was true to their own model. That may be a nice political point, but it doesn't make the point, that needs to be made. That point is that Fitch shouldn't be in business doing this anyway, because a monetarily sovereign government is not the same thing as a private sector agency, not the same thing as a company, because a monetarily sovereign government cannot go broke, unless it voluntarily defaults, on its payments. And we also need to make clear that any such voluntary default on the part of the United States would be in violation of the 14th Amendment, which states very clearly that the debt of the United States cannot be questioned. Cannot be questioned. In other words, the people in Congress cannot allow default. It's illegal to allow a default according to the Constitution. If they do allow a default, they should be sued and they should be held to account. They should be held personally responsible if they were to allow a default, because they would have violated their oath to the Constitution. Why it matters, says the Fiscal Times. I don't think it matters, but we'll get to that in a while. Ultimately, the Fitch move may be more significant for its political and symbolic effects than its fiscal or financial ones, similar to the downgrade by Standard & Poor's in 2011. There was also another downgrade by Moody's, which they don't mention here. I will cover both in a little while. My sense is that the Fitch downgrade of the U.S. credit rating is an insignificant development and will not move financial markets or the economy. RSM chief economist Joseph Bruce-Wallace said on social media, formerly known as Twitter, on the social media site formerly known as Twitter, now known as X, quote, As long as the Federal Reserve continues to treat the U.S. issues paper as AAA rated credit, so will financial market participants. That is an insightful comment because why, when Fitch does a downgrade like this, what does it think will happen? What is its theory of change? Its theory of change is that it downgrades the credit of the United States, and of course, interest rates are going to go up as a result. That's what it thinks, because it thinks the market, an independent market that sets interest rates, is going to demand higher rates because it downgraded the government. Only trouble with this theory is that interest rates are determined, as I said before, by the Federal Reserve and the Treasury Department in collaboration. They are a policy variable. That policy variable is not controlled by financial markets. It is not controlled by a loanable funds market. It is not controlled by any market. It's controlled by the Federal Reserve and the Treasury Department working together. So Fitch's theory of change is wrong. It is a neoliberal theory of change. It is based on theories of the market. In this context of the United States, a monetarily sovereign nation, it is ridiculous. As Yellen said in her statement, quote, Fitch's decision does not change what Americans, investors, and people all around the world already know, that Treasury securities remain the world's preeminent safe and liquid asset, and that the American economy is fundamentally strong, okay, unquote. Treasury securities most probably will remain the world's preeminent safe, okay, and liquid asset, though they're going to be challenged by securities that are issued by other banks and by other nations with the development of the BRICS and with the issuance of a BRICS currency, okay, for international trade. And we have to expect that. So that's the first piece that I wanted to go over. We'll be meeting some of the same themes in the second piece. The second piece is something from Forbes. What happened here? Did they screw me up? Probably.
Oh, Kay's here. Hi, Kay. Jeffrey Denton's here. He said that he shared. Thank you. Nice to see
Hello.
the gang here.
I may be blown out of the water here because I kind of set this up earlier and I was able to access this, but I appear to be behind a paywall right now. This was an article by John Harvey, otherwise known as the Cowboy Economist. And the article was basically a reply to the downgrade by Fitch. Okay, John made some of the same points that I made about the federal government, okay, as a monetary sovereign. He went through the 4 points that were stated by Fitch, which I cannot access right now. Let me see if I can find any way to manipulate this.
Then you could look up under his name. I'm sure he has it published elsewhere.
No, this is a column strictly for Forbes.
Oh, okay.
He normally does a column for Forbes. What happened is I had the article put up, and anyway, I won't be able to get it up now. It's just gone. Well, wait a minute. Let me do something else. Maybe I can do something else. Let's see. Let me see what it is here. Okay, let's see. No, I'm still getting the same thing. I probably have to clear my cache, get everything different. Okay, John, though, after rejecting most of the main points Fitch made for the same reasons, okay, that I did, what John also did was to take the fourth point made by Fitch, okay, and he recognized that as a political matter, the increasing debt burden might be hard to handle. In other words, even though from a pure financial point of view, that has no significance because the United States can make its own money, can create its own money. He thought that there might be political problems coming out of this. All I have to say is that one of the things we deal with here in the Empowering Democracy series is how these kinds of political problems might be solved. And that is through dump the corruption. So, okay, I'm going to make that point. Then I'm going to go on to two pieces of my own, which are actually one piece, because I think they have some points in them that are relevant to the Fitch issue. These will not be behind the paywall because they're old blog posts of mine going back a long way. The first one, let me present it. The first one was in response to the move made by Moody's way back in 2010, in December of 2010. And I wrote a blog post at that time entitled Moody's, Bring It On. So yesterday, as reported in Money News, Moody's made me laugh with the following pronouncements. Quote, it could move a step closer to cutting the U.S. AAA rating if President Barack Obama's tax and unemployment benefit package becomes law. Quote, the plan agreed to by Obama and Republican leaders last week, that was in a previous debt ceiling crisis in response to that, could push up debt levels, increasing the likelihood of a negative outlook on the United States rating in the coming 2 years. Quote again, a negative outlook, if adopted, would make a rating cut more likely over the following 12 to 18 months. And quote again, for the United States, the loss of the top AAA rating reduces the appeal of U.S. Treasuries, which currently rank as among the world's safest bonds. Quote, from a credit perspective, the negative effect on government finance are likely to outweigh the positive effects of higher economic growth, unquote, said Moody's analyst Stephen Hess in a report spent late on Sunday. In the event, okay, I have to point out that after the rating cut, there was no reduction of the appeal of U.S. Treasuries. In 2010, the world was in recession, and there was a notable flight to the safety of U.S. Treasuries. And the rating cut by Fitch did nothing to stop the overwhelming flight of international funds to U.S. Treasuries at that time. Fitch's forecast that the appeal of U.S. Treasuries would be reduced following its downgrade in December of 2020. This isn't Fitch. Sorry. I'm referring to Moody's here all through this. I don't know how many times I said Fitch. This article was in response to the cut in the credit rating of the United States, by Moody's. So I should have been saying Moody's this whole time with respect to this article. So they were just wrong about the reduction in the appeal of U.S. Treasuries. The appeal of U.S. Treasuries went up because the whole world was in a recession and the U.S. economy was stronger than all of the Western economies, at this time. From a credit perspective, the negative effects on government finance are likely to outweigh the positive effects of higher economic growth, unquote. Again, that was said by Moody's analyst Stephen Hess in a report he produced late on Sunday. I'm not sure what that Sunday date was. Here, Moody's is referring to the increase in the debt and the debt to GDP ratio caused by the tax deal, and also to the projected lesser value of treasuries, which will presumably lead to the U.S. paying higher interest rates and having greater interest rates on the national debt than it otherwise would have had. In addition, Moody's believes that the likely $900 billion cost of the tax deal will make the U.S. more likely to default on the national debt. So here was again this same BS we just saw from Fitch. That was what Moody's was into in 2010. I noticed that Moody's hasn't moved to do that again. It'll be interesting to see if it does. I found this a laughing matter for a number of reasons. First, as Jane Hampshire points out, Jane Hampshire was writing at Fire Dog Lake at that time. She was a very important figure in 2010 on the left side of the ledger. Only 5 days earlier, Moody's had said there was no prospect of a ratings cut if the tax deal passed. Their sudden change of opinion greatly undercuts their credibility. Jane was surely right about that. Second, as is widely known, all the ratings industries, and I ought to remind you, by the way, that I'm reading from a blog post of mine of 2010. Second, as widely known, all the ratings agencies, including Moody's, gave the CDOs and CDSs, those were the financial instruments at the time, that led to the collapse of AIG. You remember the AIG insurance company, their highest ratings. It was bailed out by the federal government at that time. In addition, they downgraded Japan's credit ratings a long time ago with no measurable impact on its bond interest rates or costs, even though Japan's debt to GDP ratio has continued to increase over time and is now in the neighborhood of 200%. By the way, last I looked, it was now up to 250% or 270%. I forget it. It's been astronomically high to other nations all these years. The credit agencies always forget about that. And by the way, Japanese interest rates, last I looked, were down around 1% or something like that, even though the debt to GDP ratio was out of sight, comparatively speaking. So one may be forgiven for wondering why anyone should listen to the ratings ravings of Moody's and other agencies at all. In fact, one may begin to suspect that their ratings have little influence on the bond markets. And also, given the Japanese case, that the bond markets don't control the interest rates that governments that are sovereign in their own currency must pay. Third, since the United States is a nation with a fiat non-convertible currency system, with a floating exchange rate and no debt denominated in any foreign currency. It is impossible for the United States to be forced into a default by any external party simply because its ability to create the money it owes its obligations is unlimited. Voluntary default could be caused by a Congress which acts stupidly and in a manner contrary to the Constitution to constrain the Treasury from paying its obligations when they come due. Coupled with a Treasury that accepts Congress's constraints in conflict with a clear admonition of the Constitution that the debts of the United States shall not be questioned. The objective risk of default by the U.S. government is not increased by the increased size of the deficit debt or debt to GDP ratio, and Moody's view that the risk of default is increased by such increases only shows that Moody's doesn't understand the monetary operations of nations sovereign in their own currencies. Increases in these numbers don't in any way lessen the constitutional authority of the government, including the Congress, to spend or make money. Its basic solvency, in other words, is untouched by the tax deal, and if Congress allows the executive to use its currency powers, then the risk of default as a result of the deal is exactly zero. Whatever additional risks exist as a result of the deal comes only from the increased likelihood that Congress mistakenly thinking that the government is like a household or ideological reasons determined to starve the beast might constrain the executive from meeting its obligations and declare a U.S. default of its obligations when there is no reason to do so. Fourth, my biggest laugh came at the underlying assumption of Moody's report, namely that its ratings and the bond markets itself actually control the interest rates that governments like the United States must pay. Sure, they will determine the interest rates as the government sits idly by and lets them drive the market. However, the Federal Reserve and the Treasury can target bond interest rates and set these for the bond markets by manipulating bank reserves. Specifically, one way to do this is that the Treasury can cease issuing long-term bonds and sell only 3-month bonds. 3-month bond interest rates are generally controlled by the overnight rates for bank reserves, and overnight rates can be driven down to near zero by flooding the banks with excess reserves. That's basically how the Japanese keep their bond interest near zero, and that's how we can do the same. And by the way, that's how we did the same as long as the Federal Reserve was committed to quantitative easing. It kept those overnight interest rates close to zero. And it did it for more than a decade, beginning in 2010 and 11. So we did what the Japanese did, and we got the same result. Low interest rates for a whole decade until the Federal Reserve, 2 years ago, started raising interest rates when it had no need to do so, but it raised the interest rates in order to fight a transitory bout of inflation, which the MMT economist was saying at the time inflation was transitory and that nothing needed to be done by the Federal Reserve, and the Federal Reserve started raising interest rates by a half point every time it met. And this, of course, contributed to inflation, made inflation worse. And we can see that from the record. Now the Federal Reserve is beginning to back off because it hasn't killed the economy quite yet. And Wall Street began to squawk about how it kept up. It might kill the economy. And so it maybe started to come down in interest rates last time and only raised them by 1/4 point. Alternatively, another move we can make to remove the effects of the bond markets and the rating agencies upon public finances is for Congress to stop requiring new debt issuance in coordination with deficit spending, and for the Treasury to stop issuing debt. If we did this, the credit rating agencies and the interest rates in the bond market would be irrelevant from that day forward. Of course, that could have been done if the Congress had minted a platinum coin, which, by the way, not many people knew about in December of 2010. But after the first half of 2011, more and more people began to realize that trillion-dollar coins could be used in order to remove the need to issue debt instruments. That knowledge became widespread in the summer of 2011, just in time for the first serious debt ceiling crisis we had had for a long time, caused by the Republicans in the spring and summer of 2011, settled by Obama, and the Republicans at the beginning of August, in that year, with some cuts in spending that hurt some people, but not as much as the fiscal cliff debacle, which took place in 2012 to 2013. But anyway, going forward, such an act of money creation by the federal government has not been undertaken. So we do continue to issue debt when there's no need to continue to issue debt. In short, the bond markets, going on with my piece here, in short, the bond markets and the ratings agencies aren't in control of U.S. public finances. They're not in a position to influence what our taxing or spending policies ought to be, or whether we will default on our obligations. In fact, at this point in history, Congress is mandating that we have a national debt. It is forcing us to have one. That's what I said, at that time. In fact, I had other blogs saying it is Congress's fault that we have, a national debt. Congress mandates that we borrow our own previously created money from the Chinese, Japanese, and Middle Eastern nations and pay them interest on a commodity, our money, that we have an unlimited ability to create, while they also complain about the very same national debt they're always recreating and increasing, and then tell us that we can't afford unemployment insurance through enough federal spending to create full employment, Social Security, Medicare for all, good educations for our kids and grandkids, and emergency programs to create new energy foundations for our economy. Forget about Moody's. They're part of the great distraction presenting us from focusing on our real problems. There's nothing that Moody's and the bond markets or the bond vigilantes, as Randy Ray likes to say, can do to hurt us unless we let them. Let's not let them. Tell them to bring it on. And if they do, tell them to keep in mind Beowulf's admonition. So Beowulf was a noted commenter, and blogger, at that time. His real name, is Carlos Mucha, and he was the first to suggest the use of trillion-dollar coins. But, quote, I'm quoting him for another reason here, quote, I don't think we'll see Moody's or any other credit rating agency based in the U.S. ever downgrade U.S. treasuries. It would cause a tremendous amount of financial loss and would leave Moody's and its executives exposed to criminal prosecution. If I were Moody's general counsel, I'd tell the CEO in no uncertain terms, do not tug on Superman's cape. I thought that was very colorful. And a quote from 14th Amendment. It says Section 5 here, but my recollection is it's Section 4 of the 14th Amendment. Quote, the validity of the public debt of the United States authorized by law shall not be questioned. And then also Beowulf liked the quote, the criminal mischief statute, 18 U.S. Code 1361, government property, okay, or contracts. Whoever, quote, whoever willfully injures or commits any depredation against any property of the United States or of any department or agency thereof, or any property which has been or is being manipulated or constructed for the United States or any department or agency thereof, or attempts to commit any of the foregoing offenses shall be punished as follows. If the damage or attempted damage to such property exceeds the sum of $1,000, by a fine under this title or imprisonment for not more than 10 years or both. If the damage or attempted damage to such property does not exceed the sum of $1,000, by a fine under this title or by imprisonment for not more than 1 year, okay, or both. So, if you question the debt of the United States, there's a possibility of fine, okay, or imprisonment, if only the government would enforce the criminal mischief statute. They should have done that to Moody's at that time. And Bill Mitchell's conclusion in his post on outlawing the credit rating agencies, yes, Bill Mitchell had such a post at the time, and he has another entertaining post right now that we're going to be going over in a few minutes. Quote, the real question that I always ask is why governments allow these undemocratic criminal organizations to exist. Okay, this is a quote from Bill Mitchell. They can just outlaw them. This would force the corporate players to create better ways of informing the markets about their risk characteristics and leave governments alone to do what they're democratically elected to do, advance public purpose. Further, as part of my preferred financial market reforms, I will render illegal a whole swag of derivative assets which would lessen the problem of pricing risks. It is time to wean the private financial markets off these agencies. The best way would be to declare them illegal. The last thing that a sovereign government should be doing right now is cutting back on its fiscal stimulus, which of course, that was the end of that quote. And my conclusion then, which of course is exactly what Moody's wants us to do, because at the time, Moody's wanted us to cut back on our fiscal stimulus, wanted us to have austerity policies, and that's why they were downgrading the credit rating of the United States. They were trying to force the United States to implement austerity policies. It turned out they didn't have to force us to do that because Barack Obama was perfectly willing to help them with that and to try to implement austerity policies for the United States. Here's another piece I did later for that time. I'm not going to have to go over this piece in any detail because it's the same as the one you just read. There was only a name change. I only mention it because it was a downgrade by Standard & Poor of the U.S. credit rating of that time, Standard & Poor's. So I title this one, of course, Standard & Poor's Bring It On. It was on April 19th, 2011. That was only months before the fiscal crisis of 2011. And depending on when you date that crisis from, it might have been somewhat in the middle of it, because I believe in April of 2011, the federal government, the Treasury Department, was already taking special measures to prevent us from running out of money, quote unquote. Anyway, my author's note. In December, I posted a piece on Moody's threat to downgrade the U.S.'s rating in international bond markets. I argued that Moody's action was foolish. Today, Standard & Poor's actually revised the U.S. ratings outlook from stable to negative, but continued its sovereign credit rating at AAA over A1 plus. This roiled the markets yesterday and led the New York Times to carry a debate among 7 economists, including Randy Wray, one of the best known among economists using the modern monetary theory paradigm in economics. Randy and a number of others in the Times debate believe the credit ratings change has little or no significance, which, by the way, also proved to be true. It had no significance. Nations kept on buying treasury bonds with great alacrity and speed. The downgrade by Standard & Poor's went the same way as the Moody's downgrade. It had no effect on the demand for treasury bonds. I go on. My post, filed in September, presents a more detailed analysis of why Randy and the other skeptics are right. So I thought it deserved a reprise. Please use your imagination and just replace Moody's with Standard & Poor's. The arguments against the credit ratings agency morons remain the same. In my view, Congress should just put them out of business. I agreed with Bill Mitchell, of course, here. Bring some indictments against them for the fraudulent AAA ratings they gave to the derivatives, the CDOs and the CDSs, that in turn triggered the crash that ruined the lives of so many people. Let's finally see some of these perps in jumpsuits, is what I said. And then I just reprinted the earlier blog, okay, with Moody's. So I get rid of that. So we are down now to the last of the posts that I wanted to go through here. This post is one by Bill Mitchell. Okay, I'm laughing because I'm always laughing when Bill talks about the credit ratings agencies. But anyway, here's his post on the Fitch thing. August 2nd, 2023. Ratings downgrade on U.S. government debt is as ridiculous as it is meaningless. It's Wednesday, and there are a few topics that warrant some comment. But at the top of these topics were headlines this morning shouting out that the U.S. Treasury bonds had been downgraded by one of those self-serving credit rating agencies, as if it was an event worthy of some import. The journalists obviously do not understand anything if they think that decision was important. They do. The journalists, we're taking note of this and treating it as if it was important. The ratings downgrade on U.S. government debt is meaningless, and the rating agency involved just wants to boost its revenue by sounding important. After I explain all that, we will have a quiet musical reflection to finish the day. Bill. Credit rating downgrade of U.S. government debt. Who cares? Asked Bill. We go through this farce regularly, and the only variables are the country name and the ratings agency involved. The basic news is that one of these self-serving, waste of time organizations, rating agencies, decided it needed some publicity, probably linked to some strategy to raise extra revenue. And so what better way than to downgrade the United States to AA plus from AAA? Shock, horror. According to the press release announcing a decision, August 1st, 2023, Fitch downgrades the United States long-term ratings to AA plus from AAA. Outlook stable. The reasons for the decision was the expected fiscal deterioration. God bless you, honey. The expected fiscal deterioration over the next 3 years, a high and growing general government debt burden, and the erosion of governance. All sorts of other factors were cited. Steady deterioration in standards of government over the last 20 years, including on fiscal and debt matters. 2, repeated debt limit political standoffs and last minute resolutions have eroded confidence in fiscal management, unquote. Government lacks a medium term fiscal framework, quote unquote, and quote, and has a complex budgeting process, unquote. And the elephant is not mentioned, which is that the U.S. government will never default in its outstanding debt, and thus there is zero credit risk for investors. One could also ask, who actually takes the recurring pantomime over the debt ceiling seriously? No one with a brain considers that political theater to be anything other than what it is. I also thought the contradiction in the Fitch rationale was hilarious. On the one hand, they cite their prediction that the U.S. economy is sliding into a recession as a reason for their decision. But a paragraph later, they claim that, quote, the resilience of the economy and the labor market are complicating the Fed's goal of bringing inflation towards its 2% target. They obviously want a recession, says Bill. Just like Moody's wanted a recession. Just like Standard & Poor's wanted a recession. Sure enough, well, actually, they had a recession earlier. They wanted to keep the country in recession by having austerity policies. Sure enough, the Federal Reserve is intent on pushing unemployment and the economy into recession, even though inflation has fallen dramatically in recent months. But surely, if Fitch is worried about debt sustainability, then it should be happy about the, quote, resilience, unquote. They are not. They are frauds. This is Bill. Anyway, not me. It's Bill. I agree in every particular, however. Anyway, the media seemed to think it was a big deal. Even the U.S. Treasury Secretary didn't address the issue correctly. She claimed that the decision was, quote, arbitrary and based on outdated data, unquote. Which begs the question, is there some data that would have justified such a stupid assessment? She obviously thinks there would be, whereas in reality, such a decision would never be justified unless the United States government was borrowing heavily in foreign currencies, which it isn't. The White House press secretary similarly chose to reject the decision on the wrong grounds. It defies reality to downgrade the United States at a moment when President Biden has delivered the strongest recovery of any major economy in the world. By the way, I think that's a false statement. I'm sure that China has had a better recovery than the United States. For one, okay. The reality it defies has nothing to do with the strength of the economy or the recovery or anything else like that. The reality it defies is that the U.S. is a currency. I think he wanted to say U.S. is a sovereign currency issuer and can always fund its outstanding liabilities at any nominal price in U.S. dollars. The last capacity is a sufficient condition to render the ratings agencies irrelevant. There is no risk of default unless the government debt is denominated in a foreign currency. That last point is also misunderstood. For example, the Peter G. Peterson Foundation likes to scare everyone about the U.S. government's national debt. In their Who Owns All Their Debt page, they claim at the end of 2022, the nation's gross debt had reached 31.4 trillion. Of that amount, about 24.5 trillion or 78% was held by the public, representing cash borrowed from domestic and foreign investors, which uninformed people interpret as borrowing heavily from foreigners. But that is different from borrowing in a foreign currency. Get that point, everybody? It's different from borrowing in a foreign currency. You can borrow heavily from foreigners in dollars. It doesn't affect your fiscal sustainability if you're borrowing dollars from them, because you can always repay those dollars. But if you borrow from them in their currencies, let's say if you borrowed from them, okay, in renminbi, the Chinese currency, then the U.S. isn't okay. Then the United States isn't able to create that currency, so it won't so easily be able to pay back, okay, the debt. Foreigners hold about 30% of the outstanding U.S. currency debt, and that proportion has been rising over the last several decades. But those holdings are possible because the foreigners have acquired U.S. dollars and have invested their stocks in government bonds. That acquisition has mostly come from running trade surpluses against the U.S. economy. So they hand over more real goods and services, thence productive resources, for the enjoyment of U.S. citizens that then the U.S. reciprocates with, and in return, they get a risk-free financial asset that will always be repaid in U.S. dollars. Isn't that wonderful? Well, in recent years, they've always thought that it was wonderful, but now they seem to be changing their minds, wanting to do similar things in currencies of their own. I can hardly blame them. In material terms, the U.S. gains from that transaction, going on with Bill's article. If I was examining the Fitch statement of his first year undergraduate student essay in macroeconomics, I would have failed them badly and advised them to explore another career option. External debt arising as liabilities of a currency issuing government denominated in the local currency is no issue. But the debt of the non-government sector may become an issue under certain circumstances, whether it is denominated in a local currency or not. Remember, the non-government sector is a user of the currency of issue. In that sense, its access to it is not much different to its access to foreign currency. It has to earn income, use prior savings, sell assets, or borrow in order to spend. Accessing foreign currency to service foreign currency denominated debt requires them to do the same. I stand by my assessment in this blog post. Time to outline the credit rating agencies. Bill published that on December 23rd, 2009. In this blog post, Ratings Agencies and Higher Interest Rates, April 26th of 2009, I recounted the hilarious Japanese downgrading by Moody's Investor Services in November of 1998. The downgrading followed the day the Japanese government had announced a large-scale fiscal stimulus to its ailing economy. The ratings agencies don't like fiscal stimuli. They don't like governments to spend money, to deficit spend, to gear up their economies. They think that's bad. Moody's Investor Service began the first of a series of downgradings of the Japanese government's yen-denominated bonds by taking the AAA rating away. The next major Moody's downgrade occurred on September 8th, 2000. Then, in December 2001, Moody's further downgraded the Japan government's yen-denominated bond rating to AA3 from AA2. On May 31st, 2002, Moody's Investor Service cut Japan's long-term credit rating by a further 2 grades to A2, or, or below that given to Botswana, Chile, and Hungary. In a statement at the time, Moody's said that its decision reflects the conclusion that the Japanese government's current and anticipated economic policies will be insufficient to prevent continued deterioration in Japan's domestic debt position. Japanese general government indebtedness, however, measured, will approach levels unprecedented in the post-war era in the developed world, and as such, Japan will be entering uncharted territory. The then Japanese finance minister responded with some foresight. Quote, "They're doing it for business. Just because they do such things, we won't change our policies. The market doesn't seem to be paying attention," unquote. Indeed, the government continued to have no problems finding buyers for their own debt, which is all yen denominated and sold mainly to domestic investors. In Moody's logic, things have deteriorated massively over the last 25 years in Japan, but none of their predictions have ever materialized. In the New York Times article at the time, Japan Battles Bond Rating, July 6, 2002, the logic of the rating was questioned. How could a country that receives foreign aid from Japan have a better rating than Japan itself? Japan, with an economy almost 1,000 times the size of Botswana's, has the world's largest foreign reserves, 446 billion, the world's largest domestic savings, that is $11.4 trillion, that is, these foreign reserves are in dollars, and about 1 trillion in overseas investments, and 95% of the debt is held by Japanese people. But again, the elephant, says Bill. Japan issues the yen. No other nation or body issues the yen. It only borrows in the currency it issues. There is zero credit risk, so the varying ratings make zero sense. Former Moody's president John Bone Jr. had in 1995 claimed that, quote, "We're in the integrity business. People pay us to be objective, to be independent, and to forcefully tell it like it is," unquote. That's a reference, Ratings Trouble, Institutional Investor, October 1995, page 245. The great financial crash, quote, "The great financial crash and subsequent congressional hearings," I'm quoting from Bill Mitchell now, "on the conduct of the ratings agencies showed they were not in the, quote, integrity business," unquote, at all. The agencies continually claim they are providing an indicator of the, quote, "probability that the issuer will default on the security over its life," unquote. Fitch's justification shows they want us to believe that as the U.S. public debt ratio rises, the risk that the U.S. government will become insolvent rises. As I said earlier here, the fact that the debt to GDP ratio rises has no bearing at all on the fiscal sustainability of the U.S. government. Their logic must be that default follows sovereign insolvency, even when the sovereign debt is denominated in the government's own currency. It doesn't take long to realize that this logic is no logic. While Japan's economy was struggling at the time, Moody's tried to get headlines. The default risk on yen denominated sovereign debt was nil, given that the yen has a floating exchange rate. Once we understand how a sovereign government operates with respect to the monetary system, this point becomes obvious. First, when a particular government bond matures, that is, becomes due for repayment, the issuing government would simply credit the bank account of the holder with the principal and interest and cancel the accounting record of that debt instrument. Simple as that. The banking reserves would rise by that amount, and the wealth of the private investor would change and mix from bond to bank deposit. Second, the massive fiscal deficits that the Japanese government has run since the 1990s just work in the same way, adding reserves on a daily basis to the banking system as people spend the yen and deposit them back into bank accounts, etc. Close paren. The bond issues are designed to give the private sector an interest-bearing financial asset to replace the non-interest-bearing bank reserves. The way the Bank of Japan, the BOJ, continues to keep the interest rate in Japan at virtually zero is by leaving some excess reserves associated with the fiscal deficits in the monetary system. They leave just enough excess reserve in the cash system overnight each day to force the interbank market to complete the rate down to zero. That, as I said before, is a policy variable. That's the way they implement the policy of low interest rates or zero interest rates. They leave just enough excess reserves in the cash system overnight to force the interbank market to keep the rate down to zero. This is a very clever way of ensuring that the longer rates, the so-called investment rates, are as low as they can be. Third, what if the Japanese government decided it didn't want to issue any more debt but still ran into deficits? Now, the net spending would still occur day by day and provide stimulus to the economy, but the liquidity effects would just remain in the excess banking reserves. This would force the private sector to hold the new net financial assets pouring in each day via the deficits in the form of reserves rather than interest-bearing bonds. The other angle on this that is often overlooked is that the bond holdings of the private sector also constitute an income source, that the government interest payments on its outstanding debt constitutes another avenue for stimulus. So when the government retires debt, it reduces private incomes. The Japanese government is very sophisticated and knew that government debt was seen as a safe haven during a decade or more of volatile economic times, and also realized that the steady and predictable income flow derived by the private sector holding the public debt was a source of security and a positive influence on growth. So any notion that a government that is running large fiscal deficits and also issuing debt for monetary policy reasons, or in the Japanese case, given that they have zero short-term interest rates anyway, for risk reduction purposes, might be a risk is ridiculous. History bears that out. Fitch and its incredulous crony agencies should be outlawed. And what Bill was listening to the morning that he wrote this particular blog, okay, he said this was a great album and my perfect for my working mood this afternoon. So I thought we might want to check this out for a minute or two. Okay, in conclusion, Bill has interesting tastes, okay, in music. That is Bill's music that he was listening to when he wrote this. Body says it's scary music. Anyway, I thought that might be a bit of entertainment for you. Okay, as we get ready to close. Okay, or as I get ready to close. Uh, I think the point of all this by now, though, should be very clear to you. Specifically, the ratings agencies don't matter. What they say doesn't matter. They need to be just ignored, or as Bill says, they need to be made illegal because they aid in persisting certain neoliberal myths. Certainly, the myth that austerity, is good for us, and certainly the myth that the interest rates are set by the bond markets. That's a major neoliberal myth. We saw here in a number of contexts that this doesn't depend, interest rates don't depend on the bond markets at all. They depend on the Treasury Department collaborating with the Federal Reserve in various ways. The interest rates are a policy variable. The primary policy institution involved in raising or lowering interest rates in the United States is, of course, the Federal Reserve. But the Treasury Department also collaborates with the Federal Reserve. For example, when the Federal Reserve wants to take down interest rates to zero, the Treasury Department will collaborate by issuing more short-term debt, which generally has lower interest rates than the long-term debt. So, so there it is. A tempest in a teapot, just another distraction. Everybody was in a tizzy. I shouldn't say everybody was in a tizzy. Some people were in a tizzy because the federal government was downgraded again.
And it's so ridiculous. I just shook my head. Like, not this again.
I'm sorry, say that again.
I was like, not this again when I saw it. You know, they just play all these games with us.
Yes. And this was, they don't play this game too often, but every once in a while they play this game and they try to get people to, what they're trying to do is get the federal government to cut back on deficit spending. And by the way, the Biden administration has had too little deficit spending. It is nowhere near the levels of the Trump administration when it comes to deficit spending. That is why we don't get the same feeling of dynamism from the Biden economy that we got from the Trump economy. Because however terrible Trump was, in many ways, he was at least running very big deficits. Why do we need really big deficits? Let's go over that for a minute. There are leakages in the economy. There are leakages from the dynamic economy, from the transactions in the economy, to savings, and also to trade deficits, current account deficits with foreign nations. history shows us that it pleases the American people very much when they can save roughly 6%, okay, of GDP. It also pleases the American people very much when they can buy a lot of foreign goods to the tune of 6% of GDP per year. So that is the leakages from the economy, okay, each year when the economy is going well tend towards 12%, okay, of GDP. That means we need 12% of GDP spending to stay neutral, not to lose ground. In the first year or so of the Biden administration, we were getting close to that. Since then, we have been going down. And so that's the problem. That's exactly the problem, because Biden learned from Obama, who learned from Clinton, that you should be cutting deficits. When you cut those deficits, you have the leakages to the economy each year, those substantial leakages. It may be you won't have a leakage of 6%, okay, because people won't have the money anymore to import those goods. So what you've done is cut down their access to external goods and services. It may also be that people won't save the 6% of GDP they want to save because they're short of money. But neither of these two things is good for the economy. When you cut deficits down to 6%, you're limiting the private sector savings, okay, of people. And you're also limiting their demand for foreign goods, so you're hurting the world economy. None of these things, okay, are good results. So among the things Biden has been doing wrong is that he's been cutting deficits by too much. I don't think you're going to hear that in too many places other than here, because people are constantly losing those points. Those have to do with the sectoral financial balance model in the economy. Very few economists talk about that. But they're real important for what happens in the macro economy, and real important for being able to predict the up and down cycles, okay, in the economy. So I guess I'm going to leave things there. I guess Lana was here for a brief time. I don't know if she's still here. She might be. Jeff Denton was here. Kay Ryan was here. Jeff says quantitative easing propped up Trump's economy, and then he got to blame the pandemic. It wasn't so much the quantitative easing that propped up his economy, Jeff. Trump had more substantial deficit spending due to the tax cut stuff than Biden had. That's what was propping up his economy. Jeff says, Democrats didn't say boo about it. Lana says, my phone rang, but I am back now. Good. Okay, folks. Dee, have you got anything more you would like to add?
Biden is just, like we said, neoliberal through and through. when he said he wasn't, what was that statement he made? But he hasn't kept any campaign promises anyway. He hasn't.
There are many, many campaign promises he has not kept. Okay, among those, of course, is the $15 an hour minimum wage.
Mm-hmm.
He torpedoed that himself when he told everybody he respected the parliamentarian, and when he decided not to require his buddies in Congress to vote for Bernie Sanders' amendment. There were 8 defecting votes from the Democrats in relation to that amendment in opposition to the restoration of the $15 an hour provision in the American the American Rescue Plan. He didn't exert any pressure on Congress.
No.
He didn't exert any pressure on the conservative senators that he has the most influence with. Even 2 senators from Delaware who were always in his pocket. Even 2 senators from New Hampshire who follow him around like little puppy dogs. He didn't put any pressure on John Tester. He didn't put any pressure on Angus King. And of course, he didn't put the slightest bit of pressure on Joe Manchin or Kristen Sinema. And those were the 8 senators who voted against the amendment that was proposed by Bernie Sanders.
I believe here at 7:30 tomorrow morning.
Say that again?
I'm sorry, that was my sister who just came by. Never mind.
Oh, okay. Okay.
But he's not a Democrat. As much as he has a D after his name, I don't see how he's a Democrat.
Yeah, actually, I don't see how he's a Democrat either. And Barney doesn't see how he's a Democrat either.
Mm-hmm. Shake your head.
Yeah, she's always telling me he's not a real Democrat.
She's right. He's not.
Yes, I agree. He is not a real Democrat.
Okay, we got some more comments here.
Yes, we do. Kay says, we should have had Bernie. And Lana says, we certainly should have had Bernie. Boy, would we be in much better shape today if we had successfully elected Bernie in 2016, or if we had successfully selected Bernie in 2020. We'd be in much better shape even 2020. But we would be today in marvelous shape as a country if we had elected Bernie in 2016. What a difference that would have made.
It would have had a traditional Democrat.
Stephanie Kelton would have become either the chief economic advisor or the chairperson of the National Economics Council. Is that what it's called? Okay, I forget. She certainly would have had a very high position inside of the administration. Probably Jamie Galbraith would have become the Secretary of the Treasury. Maybe Warren Mosler would have become the chairperson of the Federal Reserve. That would have been really interesting. And we said, we
But we would
certainly,
have had a traditional Democrat is what we haven't had in a long time.
yes. So Lana says, I need to bring you up to speed on our M4A event on Saturday. It was fabulous. Yes, you do. I was about to raise that. And I was actually going to call you about it today sometime. But I had a very bad night sleeping last night. And so to sort of catch up today and get ready for this stream, I took 2 long naps during the day. Uh, so Keith Ellison and Ilhan Omar both made an appearance. That's wonderful. That's wonderful. How was Kip's talk, Lana? Also, did Joe Jarvis make it there? Lana says, that's okay. Naps are good. Yeah, one was about an hour and a half nap, the other was about an hour. Kip, lots of statistics. Yeah, Kip always brings the numbers. That's one of the things I really like about him. It was Joe Jarvis there too. Oh, I forgot. Scott was there. Scott was coming too. That must have been wonderful. That must have been really wonderful. Lana said, I gave a silly 10-minute talk. I'll bet it was fabulous, Lana. Okay, when would be a good time to call? Dave said, I should be a stand up comedian. Well, Jimmy Dore has made quite a career about being a stand up comedian and doing live streams on politics. Okay, any more comments, Lana? Or D? Sorry, say that again.
I think you covered pretty much of what you wanted to cover.
Oh, I did, yeah. Yep.
And we're not going to see any change until we dump the corruption, right? Get rid of the
Oh, yeah. That's absolutely
incumbent.
true. We're in a particularly tight spot now because, of course, we have Biden falling. I guess Trump and Biden are in a dead heat now with respect to favorability ratings. And Biden is going down because he's doing such an incompetent job. And it looks like the two major parties are going to nominate the two really corrupt people, specifically Biden, okay, and Trump. And they're going to have all the money in the world. And how can we possibly beat them if people will not pick up on the dump the corruption mantra? I mean, there is no way that they can be beaten. Well, I suppose there's a small possibility that Bobby Kennedy could beat him. But if he's going to beat him in the context where there's no uptake of the dump the corruption idea, the only way he'd be able to beat him would be to take lots and lots of money and get lots and lots of money from the billionaires, those of them who don't want to see either of the two of them the president of the United States again. But that would make Bobby Kennedy beholden to those billionaires. And that would ruin his presidency in certain very critical areas. So that's where we are, I think. I don't think we're in a very good place.
No, we're not. Kay wrote down, would be in a way better place with Bernie, and that's the truth.
And that is the truth, the absolute truth. We'd be in a way better place with Bernie. I couldn't agree more. We'd be in a way better place. I think we'd be in a better place, should I say, if Bernie would have run now. I don't know. I think the faith in Bernie is gone, okay, in relation to the really left people who powered both his campaigns. Okay, Bernie looks like a real caver right now at this point.
Exactly.
And I don't know if he could get the mass following revved up again if he would have run a third time.
I think he would be able to.
There's been speculation that Biden isn't going to make it, that he won't be able to run, that he'll just be too sick or too dysfunctional to continue. Okay, I don't know if that will happen, okay, or not.
I think it will.
Well, people are thinking about it, and today I've heard that there's been some serious consideration around DNC circles of putting up, guess who? But Gavin Newsom instead as the candidate of the Democratic Party. So that would mean we would get, okay, another neoliberal, okay, in office. Someone basically coming from the Nancy Pelosi, Hillary wing of the Democratic Party. I don't know whether foreign policy would change. And foreign policy must change. Okay, Lana says Dean Phillips as well. Did Dean Phillips think you would make a good stand-up comedian? Kay says, okay, guys, I'm out of here. I love you all. We love you, Kay.
Hey, good night, Kay.
So take care, and I hope you're well for tomorrow night. I think it's time to close now.
Yes, and we just want to remind everybody to please hit the like button, subscribe, and share. Yes, we know people are going to be watching later, and it would help Joe out if people could do that.
Oh,
It would
yes.
mean a lot to subscribe to his channel.
Please buy us some coffees, both of us. Dee still doesn't have her Buy Me a Coffee account up there.
Okay, it's Buy Me a Coffee and then D Piers, just as you see it on the screen, D Piers. But it's, like one word.
Right. Okay. So it's Buy Me a Coffee / D Piers.
Yes.
That's all. Okay. And my Buy Me a Coffee account is flashing across the bottom of the screen right now. And also my Patreon account is above in my identifier. Either of the two would be nice places to visit. Okay, Lana, what's a good time to get a hold of you? Okay, I think I'm going to say goodnight.
Yes, good night, everybody. Good night, Bonnie.
Good night. I guess I'll
Yep,
call.
see you tomorrow. 8 p.m. Eastern Time and also 9 p.m. Eastern Time.
Tomorrow, yes. 9 p.m. Eastern Time for my show, and 8 p.m., which will be a Dump the Corruption show. Oh, Solana says no. Dean is thinking of running for president. Oh, God. That's amazing. Congressman Dean Phillips, who is Lana Dell's congressperson.
Wow.
He's a pretty awful Democrat, among other Democrats. Okay, Lana. Okay, I'm going to end this now. I'll call you in 5 minutes just to find out when a good time to talk is. Okay. Okay, it's not now. But everybody, thank you very much for coming, and I'll see you tomorrow.